I was one of the new 101 instructors that Phil spoke of being in the training class over the summer, as was Rebecca. And I don't have the problem of being close in age to my students, but all the other issues that he talked about definitely apply. I'd never taught before, and it was incredibly nerve-wracking getting up in front of the classroom for the first time and not knowing what to expect. So coming from a background as an undergrad in psychology and women's studies, I'm a huge research nerd, and my brain kicks over and says, well, this might be an anxiety-producing situation, but it sure is interesting. So my paper is sort of a preliminary examination of some issues that I'm working on turning into some kind of quantitative research probably next year. Kind of a little bit of picking apart the methodology and the goals, the guiding questions. I don't have any grand conclusions. Think of this as part one. But it's teaching styles and the role of mindfulness in English 101 instruction, part one. I'm also losing my voice, I apologize. Mindfulness, an intentional and frequently transparent moment-by-moment awareness of what one is doing, how and why, is the foundation for success in a variety of endeavors. A mindful runner is constantly aware of stride, surroundings, energy level, and hydration. A mindful chef knows how long the chicken has been in the oven, how hot the pan will be when it's removed, and how many people it will serve, sometimes with an eerie level of accuracy. A mindful gardener knows that something isn't quite right, even before the signs and symptoms organize themselves into the onset of a fungal disease or nutritional deficiency. A certain shade of green, a certain tilt of leaf or quality of soil communicates all there is to know. Mindfulness, then, can produce safe and healthy athletes, tasty chicken in the proper proportions, and thriving tomato plants. As a first-year graduate student and new instructor for 2 sections of English 101, I've been asked during the past several months, I'm close to a year now, to be extremely mindful, to reflect on my every action, learning, teaching, responding to student writing, my organizational skills, time management, discovering and maintaining my teacherly classroom persona, and even my habits and patterns of reflection. Along with each of the other first-year graduate students, I was also asked to observe other instructors in the classroom, be in turn observed by them, and describe what I learned from the experience. This combination of introspection and observation prompted me to marvel over the multitude of substantially divergent teaching styles amongst my peers. Some of us are quiet, some considerably louder and more animated. Some of us move around the classroom while others remain close to a desk or a table. Some smoothly facilitate rousing student discussions, while others excel at explaining complicated concepts, walking students through the maze of citation formats, relating classroom activities to course goals, or generalizing learning to students' academic or career goals. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and we all have very different ways of approaching the same material, addressing the same course goals, and maintaining a day-to-day atmosphere conducive to learning with groups of students who, while extremely diverse in other ways, are all taking the same required composition course. These observations, coupled with several heated debates in our required pedagogy class, prompted me to wonder to what extent it could be useful to examine these differences in a less casual, more precise manner than that afforded by my one-on-one interactions and conversations with my fellow instructors. Would they find it productive, enlightening, perhaps even enjoyable, to more closely scrutinize their behavior and attitudes in the classroom? Or would they prefer to exclaim, as I've often found myself declaring, about grammar, or the amount of flour in a pumpkin roll recipe, or the composition of compost, that when it comes to teaching, I don't know why that way is right, it just is. What would mindful teaching look like? How would it differ from flying by the seat of your pants teaching, or from the more moderate stance between the two perspectives from which most of us tend to operate? These general questions led to more specific ones. What are the distinct traits that may be used to describe who we are as teachers? What role in classroom differences is played by instructors' attitudes toward teaching, or toward learning, or toward young people, higher education, authority, composition, technology, and other aspects of the situation? Does the instructor's level of comfort in the classroom, their sense of appropriateness to the designated role, have an impact on other aspects of teaching? To what extent do instructors' self-perceptions influence how they present themselves in the classroom? How do these varying presentations and perceptions differentiate each from her or his peers, who have their own pre-existing attitudes and perceptions as well? I became especially curious about ways in which these pre-existing differences approach the clusters of beliefs, attitudes, and overt behaviors behaviors that instructors generally perform from the basis of an unexamined sense of what seems right, but which are in turn ripe for analysis, might be examined in a systematic fashion. Could distinct categories of behavior be discovered? How? What might those categories look like? Would they be mostly exclusive or intricately overlapping? What strategies could be used to avoid various types of bias, to avoid merely replicating my own expectations through observation and interpretation of data? Conversely, how could I be sure that the instructors, whose behavior and attitudes I wish to examine and categorize, they're a generally intelligent and alert bunch, wouldn't read extra layers of interpretation into any measure I used with them, skewing my results all over the place by implementation of the same pre-existing, unexamined ideologies I sought to examine? As tends to be the case, if there's a question, somebody somewhere has already attempted to answer it. I found several pre-existing measures that aim to group various teacher behaviors into recognizable categories. Anthony Gracia, a social psychologist who also wrote extensively about the learning styles of young adults, helped in 1996 to create a teaching style inventory using 4 clusters. Each cluster is defined by the extent to which the teacher predominantly utilizes combinations of 5 teaching styles, such as formal authority or facilitator. Another measure, Daniel Pratt's Teaching Perspectives Inventory from 2001, focuses less on specific actions within the classroom, but it includes instructors' intentions and beliefs about the purposes of teaching, and designates a dominant perspective from a list of 5 for each instructor. A related measure, created by researchers Angelo and Cross in 1993, is the Teaching Goals Inventory, which helps college instructors become more aware of their own priorities in teaching, and which divides the goals of instruction into 6 categories. For example, discipline-specific knowledge and goals, or work and career preparation. Initially, I planned to mimic somewhat the structure of these measures and the earlier research that led to their development. In Dr. Gracia's book, Teaching with Style, he describes the basic methodology of earlier studies upon which he based some of his work. He says, various components of our modes of behavior often cluster into general patterns. In a study of the teacher behaviors mentioned in 500 nomination letters for teaching awards at the University of North Carolina, Joseph Lopeman, 1994-1995, found that the descriptions used fit into 2 categories: intellectual excitement and interpersonal rapport. Trained judges summarized the themes in the written descriptions into one-word descriptors, and those associated with each category in Loman's study are found in Table 1-2. Table 1-2 contains columns of, indeed, one-word descriptors, which are, as Gracia goes on to describe, later used in various forms of assessment. The assessment involves a "this applies to the instructor" versus "this does not apply to the instructor" style scale, sometimes cross-referenced with students' ratings of the instructors overall as between very good and very poor. All the terms in this example are generally positive. You get inspiring, knowledgeable, eloquent, caring, and fair, because these are from award nomination letters, of course. But some involve more complex shades of meaning than others, for example, personal. And some are even open to negative interpretation. For example, demanding and exciting could just as easily describe a near-death experience as an enjoyable composition course. Each word could be applied to an instructor's behavior in the classroom from a variety of perspectives, that of the students, any non-student observers, or even the instructor's own point of view, in a reflective mode of self-examination. In examining the various pre-existing measures, I was both inspired and troubled. In my own study, I had hoped my peers and I would generate consistent clusters of terms, with cohesive commonalities of theme and function. I planned to use interview and survey methods to generate a list of traits perceived by first-year graduate teaching instructors teaching English 101, both in their own classroom behaviors and in that of their peers. I would then use this master list as the basis for a second survey in which the instructors would designate which traits most described them and which were least applicable. In this second survey, I hoped to discover patterns of response that delineated categories of related traits. These categories could be seen as representative of teaching styles in this group. Finally, I planned to interview respondents who fell into differing teaching style categories about their attitudes toward teaching, their classroom management strategies, and the specific activities they used with their students. This combination of quantitative and qualitative research strategies would, I hoped, be effective in generating new information. I began to see both the difficulties and the possibilities inherent in examining teaching styles, and in attempting to bring about a more mindful state of instruction. The potential for bias is enormous, as there's no way to generate the study itself in a vacuum. Short of having the initial participants flip through every word in the English language and point out the ones that do and do not describe themselves or their colleagues. The value and the meaning of the selected terms, even lumped together with positive, negative, and everything between, are subject to interpretation by participants and are nearly infinitely malleable, dependent on the background and experiences of the various people involved. Further, I was faced with the problem of potentially contaminating my ideal sample, my fellow instructors, by introducing the issue of my sample's familiarity with the measure, which would call into question the validity of any future data gathering. I had, as the saying goes, quite effectively painted myself into a corner. I did decide, though, on the principle that it couldn't hurt, and I was intrigued by the challenge, to go ahead and generate a trait list. Over the course of several days, I jotted down 155 words and phrases, some decidedly preliminary, that I felt could be used to describe myself or some of my peers in our roles as teachers. As it turned out, the process of generating, with some informal peer assistance, the trait list was in itself useful, though in unexpected ways. As I stared blankly at my trait list, wondering what categories may have been generated if I had let my peers loose on a survey version of the list, I noticed that there were already some clearly perceptible categories present. While in an experimental situation, this observation would obviously be problematic and introduce even more potential for bias. For example, would I inadvertently encourage subjects to select pre-grouped traits by spacing them too closely in the survey? Would I somehow convey my own perceptions of these categories and how I phrase the instructions? Under the circumstances, I found it useful, interesting, and worth pursuing further. Most of the categories that I saw, jumping out of the trait list like an image in a magic eye picture, did parallel one segment or another of the previously created measures. For example, Pratt's nurturing or social reform perspectives showed up. Angela and Cross's focus on personal development or work and career preparation, which on my list is called that thing that Phil does, but I can't remember the word for it. And Pratt's expert/formal authority cluster. Others did not. Some of the categories, most of which I was best able to express in paired dichotomies, had much to do with classroom behavior. For example, I mentioned quiet and chatty and active and sedentary as opposed to traits. While others were more appropriately applied to instructors' own perceptions of themselves. For example, confident versus timid, conventional versus quirky, and two that are pretty similar, excited versus anxious. Similar but different. The two pairs that stood out most to me, though, as generalizable descriptors of instructor traits were firm versus lenient and disengaged versus involved. Firm versus lenient mostly has to do with role enforcement, both the teacher's actual day-to-day rule enforcement, and also their perception of it. You could be, I think, firm and still think of yourself as lenient, so there's some wiggle room there. And disengaged and involved is the extent to which the instructor kind of prioritizes teaching as a part of their lives. For example, this nice young lady in the first row here holds student conferences on Saturdays. I am not that involved. And then there are people who are farther over on that side of the spectrum than I, too, who really don't feel like answering student emails or things like that. So there's a line for each of those. From these two pairs, I created a matrix looking at my own and other instructors' classroom behaviors, attitudes, and self-perceptions as positioned within it, on each line within it. Is this tool useful? I believe it can be when more fully developed. Are there other options opened up for future research? Certainly, and I intend to pursue them. And of course, the final question remains, can measures like this one be used in positive ways to provoke mindfulness and intentionality in teaching, rather than to negatively complicate the artistic, unstudied inclinations of instructors? Pending free time, I intend to spend the 2012-2013 academic year answering these questions.